The mountains stretched endlessly, blue ridges folding into one another, their peaks shrouded in morning fog. The winding road leading up to them was narrow and cracked, lined with mossy stones and the occasional gnarled tree that leaned over the asphalt like a silent sentinel. The car bumped over loose gravel, its engine growling in protest, and the tourists inside, 3 friends and 1 cousin who had insisted on coming, watched the forest swallow the horizon. Every mile brought them deeper into a world that felt untouched by time. Civilization thinned quickly. No gas stations, no houses. Just the continuous line of towering hardwoods and the occasional rock face rising sharply from the slope. The smell of damp leaves, pine resin, and earth filled the air, heavy and alive. Somewhere in the distance, the river twisted through the valley like silver ribbon, its sound faint but persistent, echoing off cliffs. By the time they reached the cabin, late afternoon had already begun to slip into twilight. The structure sat against a steep incline, logs darkened with age, the roof sagging and lined with thick moss. Ivy curled over the corners, and the porch leaned precariously, its wooden planks groaning under the weight of years. From the distance, the cabin seemed more a part of the mountain than a human dwelling, a relic swallowed by the forest. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine and something older, an earthy, dusty scent that carried the weight of decades. The walls were lined with faded quilts, warped shelves, and the occasional knick-knack. Rusted tools, hand-carved figurines, glass jars clouded with sediment. The floorboards groaned under their weight, and sunlight slanted through the windows in golden streaks that barely reached the corners of the room. The town they had passed on the way up had felt like a pause between worlds. Small clapboard houses leaned against each other, and the main street was narrow, cobbled, and quiet. Inside the general store, the gray-bearded man behind the counter had glanced at their backpacks, at the hiking boots coated in city dust, and his eyes darkened. "Don't wander too far," he had said, voice low, heavy with a seriousness that made them pause. He leaned closer, almost conspiratorial. "And whatever you do, don't touch the Bloodroot." The words had sounded like superstition, the kind of local legend one laughs about when recounting it in city bars. They joked on the way up the mountain about hillbilly witches and magical plants, laughter echoing unnaturally loud against the tight mountain walls. But the word lingered. Bloodroot. It had a sound that carried weight beyond explanation, a syllable that seemed to hum with old danger. The first evening in the cabin passed in uneasy comfort. They unpacked, settled into rooms that smelled of wood smoke and decay, and lit a small fire in the hearth. The flames crackled, sending flickering shadows across walls lined with artifacts of lives long past. Outside, the forest pressed close, its presence palpable even through thick walls. Wind whispered in the treetops, though no breeze touched the cabin, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and the faint, almost metallic tang of something else. Something alive. One of them, more curious than cautious, picked up a pamphlet left on the cabin table. It was a tourist guide, a thin booklet of history and folklore. Leafing through it, they found a short passage on the Bloodroot, a small white flower with red sap, rare, fragile, and sacred. The pamphlet hinted at its use in medicine by early settlers, but it also carried warnings. The plant should never be disturbed. Those who take it from the wild without permission feed the soil with their own blood. The text read, accompanied by a crude illustration of a root bleeding into the earth. The others laughed nervously, calling it old superstition. But even as they joked, a cold draft crept into the room, rustling the pages of the pamphlet despite no open windows. It was the kind of cold that felt alive, brushing against skin and hair, curling in corners like smoke. Outside, shadows deepened, twisting and shifting against the last light of day. As night fell, the forest transformed. Trees, massive and twisted, rose like columns of shadow, their trunks stretching into darkness beyond the reach of the firelight. Every rustle of leaves seemed amplified, every snap of a twig a warning. The mountains themselves seemed to inhale, drawing the mist into valleys and hollows, pressing it against the cabin walls. Whippoorwills called intermittently, their mournful cries echoing off distant cliffs, lonely and repetitive, as though calling across centuries. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by distant noises, branches tapping against one another in dry rhythm, or the low scraping of something moving in the underbrush. Dreams were uneasy. Flickers of pale flowers, veins of red sap crawling beneath skin, and a voice whispering through the mist. By midnight, the forest had settled into a tense stillness. The cabin sat alone, surrounded by the thick trees and the weight of the mountains. The fire had died down, leaving shadows in every corner. And somewhere, beyond the circle of light, the bloodroot waited. Patient, silent, hungry. Morning broke in a thin, gray haze that draped the mountains in muted light. Mist clung to every slope and hollow, curling around tree trunks and stones like a living thing. The friends moved cautiously along the trail that wound down from the cabin, boots sinking into damp leaves and soil. Each step echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness, every snapped twig startling them into tense silence. The air smelled of wet pine and earth, sharp and raw, with a faint metallic tang that made their stomachs churn. The forest seemed aware of them. Branches shifted even when there was no wind. Moss-covered rocks seemed to lean closer, and shadows pooled unnaturally in corners of the trail. The mountains pressed against them from all sides. A suffocating embrace, beautiful and hostile. It was the one who had always been the boldest, the skeptic, the one who needed proof of everything, who found it first. He knelt in the mossy undergrowth, brushing leaves aside, revealing a small, white flower growing directly out of dark soil. 8 narrow petals fanned delicately around a tiny golden heart. Its stem trembled in the morning wind, dripping faint red sap that glistened in the dim light. He reached for it with careful curiosity. The others called out, half joking, half warning, but he ignored them, convinced it was just another wildflower. The moment his fingers brushed the stem, it snapped cleanly. Dark red liquid oozed from the break, thick and sticky, staining his hand like fresh blood. A sharp chill shot through the group. Even the mist seemed to pause around them, the forest holding its breath. "It's just a plant," he said. But his voice lacked conviction. He tucked the root into his pack, brushing off the sap with trembling fingers. The others followed behind him reluctantly, uneasy. Something about the flower had changed the air. The wind carried a strange, wet rustle, as if the forest had noticed the theft. By the time they returned to the cabin, the light had faded. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, cast by the dying sun and the flickering fire they had built in the hearth. The one who carried the bloodroot sat quietly, staring at his hand. A small red mark had appeared on his wrist, dark and vein-like beneath the skin. He pulled his sleeve down, hiding it, but not before the others saw. The first night was restless. Outside, the forest seemed to come alive in subtle ways. Branches tapped against the cabin, long, deliberate strokes, like fingernails dragging across wood. Leaves rustled, though there was no wind. A soft dragging sound circled the building, and every so often they heard it. A low, wet scraping, coming closer than it should, then fading. The mark on the wrist throbbed, faint at first, then pulsing steadily, as if the bloodroot itself had reached inside him. His dreams were restless. He saw visions of the flower, white petals dripping with red, growing through skin and bone. The forest whispered, voices too faint to understand, chanting in rhythm with his heartbeat. He woke in a cold sweat, shaking, the red mark now brighter, pulsing under the skin as if alive. The others tried to rationalize it. Allergy, irritation, something psychological. But each sound from outside, the branches scraping, the soft dragging, the rustle of invisible feet, made their rationality crumble. They huddled in the cabin, watching shadows pool and stretch unnaturally. Each floorboard creak, each gust of wind, felt like the forest was pressing closer, waiting. By midnight, the tension had become unbearable. They huddled together near the dying fire, listening. Somewhere in the mist, something moved. Not deer, not wind, not any sound they had ever known. Something deliberate, patient, aware. The red-marked one felt it first, a pressure in his chest, a pull he could not resist. His breathing quickened, heart hammering. The bloodroot in his pack seemed to pulse in reply, a quiet heartbeat synchronized with the forest. He tried to ignore it, tried to sleep, but the forest would not allow it. Outside, shadows shifted and stretched along the undergrowth. A faint figure passed near the porch, pale and thin, too fleeting to recognize, yet unmistakably alive. Something brushed against the cabin wall, soft and wet, leaving a thin smear of red. Morning came slow and reluctant. The forest was quiet again, but heavier, oppressive, watching. The red mark had spread slightly up his forearm, tendrils visible beneath the skin, and it throbbed with a slow, insistent pulse. The friends exchanged worried glances, but none could admit aloud what they feared. The bloodroot had marked him. The forest had noticed, and the mountains were patient. The morning mist hung thick over the ridges, curling between tree trunks and blanketing the forest floor in gray-white folds. Every step along the trail seemed muffled, swallowed by the fog. The group moved cautiously, their boots sinking into damp leaves and moss, their eyes darting to every shadow, every twitch of the branches. The mountains pressed around them, silent and immense, a living presence that seemed to weigh on their shoulders. The one who had taken the bloodroot stayed behind the others, glancing repeatedly at his wrist. The red mark had grown, spreading up his forearm in thin, pulsing veins. He kept it hidden under his sleeve, but every so often, it throbbed visibly beneath the skin, a warning he could not ignore. Each pulse was a drumbeat in his chest, echoing the rhythm of something ancient beneath the earth. By midday, subtle signs began to appear. Small scratches marred the cabin door frame, thin and red, too delicate to be from any animal. Footprints appeared in the moss outside, large and uneven, dragging slightly, as if something heavy had walked through the underbrush and then vanished. The friends noticed them in silence, unease spreading faster than the sun across the mountains. The first night was the true awakening. Branches scraped against the cabin walls, long, deliberate scratches that echoed like claws over wood. Something moved in the mist, slow and purposeful. Shadows twisted and stretched against the dim firelight, pooling in corners that had been empty moments before. The forest itself seemed to lean in, pressing closer with each passing hour, patient and hungry. Then came the scream. Not a shout, not a cry, but a short, broken wail that split the night like a blade. It came from the one who had taken the Bloodroot. The remaining friends rushed to his room, fumbling with the doorknob, but it was locked. They forced the door open, hearts hammering, and found the room empty. The bed was untouched, but the red-marked root lay in the center of the floor, its sap thick and dark, spreading across the wood like blood. Outside, the mist swirled unnaturally. The forest no longer seemed simply alive, it was aware. Trees bent slightly toward the cabin, their twisted branches reaching, testing, probing. The friends huddled together, silent, listening as the forest whispered in a language they could not understand. The sound of rustling leaves became rhythmic, deliberate, circling the cabin like a predator marking its prey. The red-marked one tried to steady himself, but the veins under his skin pulsed violently now, glowing faintly in the dim light. His movements were jerky, nervous, drawn toward the windows despite himself. The forest tugged at him, not physically, but with a pull he could not resist. The others grabbed at his arms, trying to drag him away, but he shook them off, eyes wide and unblinking, drawn like a moth to the flame. A second scream cut through the night. The cabin shook as if the mountains themselves had exhaled. Branches lashed against the walls, roots snaked along the floorboards, and the mist swirled thicker than ever. Something, or many somethings, moved just beyond the porch, pale shapes twisting in ways that defied anatomy, limbs elongated, rooted, and dripping with dark sap. The forest was no longer a passive observer. It was hunting. By morning, only two remained. The red-marked one had vanished entirely, taken into the forest by unseen forces, leaving behind only a smear of blood sap on the porch and the echo of ragged breathing. The survivors barricaded themselves in the cabin loft, hearts pounding, listening as the forest circled below. Every sound, the snap of a branch, the soft slither of roots through moss, the whisper of wind, was amplified, threatening, intimate. They understood finally what they had done. The Bloodroot was no ordinary plant. It had chosen its owner, and the forest had claimed him. The mountains were patient but relentless. The surviving pair realized they were marked as well. The forest watching, waiting, testing. Every shadow was alive. Every rustle a reminder that what had taken their friend was only the beginning. The mist outside thickened, curling into unnatural shapes that pressed against the cabin walls. The Bloodroot pulsed beneath the soil somewhere nearby, a heartbeat that echoed through the floorboards. They had escaped the first grasp of the forest. But the hunt had only begun. The morning air was damp and heavy, clinging to their skin like a second layer. Mist draped the ridges in endless gray folds, curling through trees and around rocks, muffling the forest into eerie silence. Every step toward the town at the base of the mountains felt both necessary and futile. The missing friend, the one who had taken the Bloodroot, was gone, vanished into the forest without a trace, leaving the remaining two with an unspoken terror that pressed against their chests like stone. The town appeared suddenly, a cluster of weathered houses, shuttered storefronts, and a single road winding through it like a crooked spine. The streets were empty, but the mountains loomed behind, massive and silent, watching. It felt as though the town itself existed only to remind visitors that the forest was not separate. It was inescapable. The library was a squat brick building, vines curling over its doorway like grasping fingers. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and paper, musty and ancient. Shelves leaned with age, their wooden bones groaning under the weight of knowledge. An elderly librarian, gray hair tied back with a faded ribbon, motioned them toward a section labeled Local History and Folklore. She did not ask who they were, why they had come, or what had happened. She simply opened a leather-bound tome, its pages yellowed and brittle, and began speaking in a voice low and careful, as if afraid the forest itself might overhear. "The Bloodroot," she said, "is not a plant to be plucked without understanding. It grows where the earth remembers, where the dead are not at rest. Long before settlers came here, the people believed the root carried the life of the land itself. It fed on blood, yes, but not out of malice. It demanded balance. Take it wrong, and the forest will call it back and take you in return." The pages showed detailed sketches of the root, white and delicate, veins of red sap pulsing through its fibers. The drawings depicted people, hands entwined with roots, faces half swallowed by earth, veins crawling across skin in terrifying mimicry of the plant. The librarian's voice dropped to a whisper. "Those who disrespect it disappear. Sometimes found, sometimes not. Bodies twisted, roots growing through them as if claiming them for the soil. Others vanish entirely, leaving only a stain on the ground, as if the earth itself consumed them. The mountains remember. The forest never forgets. The Bloodroot is patient, always patient." The two survivors listened, hearts hammering, stomachs twisting. Every word seemed to echo in the lofts of their minds, resonating with the restless fear that had kept them awake all night. Outside, the wind rattled shutters and carried the faint metallic smell of something decayed. Every rustle of leaves seemed to punctuate the librarian's warning. They left the library, the tome heavy in their hands, their minds racing with fragments of the lore. The forest seemed different now, more aware, more insistent. Moss-covered trees leaned slightly, shadows moving in ways they should not. The mist clung to the undergrowth, thick and shifting, forming shapes that teased the edge of vision. Limbs too long, shadows bending unnaturally, glimpses of pale shapes in the distance. Back at the cabin, The red-marked wrist pulsed faintly, veins glowing under skin. The mark had spread further since the night before, the color deepening like fresh blood beneath the surface. Every step, every movement, seemed to draw the forest closer, as though sensing their fear, marking them for what they had taken. They pored over the notes and pamphlets again, piecing together fragments. The bloodroot had been used in rituals, often as a protective offering to the forest, or in medicine to heal, but always with respect and intent. Theft, ignorance, or mockery could never be forgiven. The forest demanded balance, and balance came at a cost. Night fell quickly, heavier than before. Outside, the mist thickened, curling through the branches, whispering in voices just out of comprehension. The red mark throbbed stronger, synchronizing with a rhythm they could feel in their bones, a heartbeat not their own. The cabin seemed smaller, confined, the walls pressing inward. Shadows stretched impossibly, pooling in corners, reaching toward the survivors like dark water. Something moved in the forest. A pale, twisted figure, limbs entwined with roots, its presence almost a part of the trees themselves. It was patient, watching, testing, circling. Every time they approached a window, they glimpsed it just beyond the mist. Motionless, yet alive. Their breaths caught each time. The mountains waited. By the end of the night, they understood fully. The forest was no longer merely a backdrop. It was active, deliberate, and hungry. The bloodroot had marked them, tethered them to its ancient pulse, and the hunt had begun. Night fell abruptly over the mountains, swallowing the last of the dim light. The cabin, once a safe haven, now seemed like a fragile barrier against something immense, patient, and intelligent. Outside, the forest pulsed with a life of its own. Moving subtly at first, branches swaying in ways wind could not explain, leaves rustling even in still air. But soon the movements became deliberate, purposeful. The red-marked survivor stayed near the hearth, staring at his glowing veins, every heartbeat echoing like a drum in the hollow cabin. His friend moved closer, the two of them exchanging silent glances, both knowing that the forest outside was no longer passive. Something had been awakened, and it had chosen them as prey. Footsteps, or something like footsteps, came from the forest. Not the light, bounding gait of a deer, but heavy, dragging motions, deliberate and uneven. The mist that had clung to the mountains all day now pressed into the cabin, thick and curling, swirling around the porch and seeping through every crack. Shapes formed in the fog, limbs too long, pale, intertwined with roots, moving with a grace that no human could possess. Eyes glinted faintly, reflecting the firelight. The first attack was subtle. A branch lashed at the cabin wall, splintering the wood. A scraping sound circled the building, moving closer and closer with a slow rhythm, like claws testing a trap. The friends scrambled, dragging furniture to barricade doors and windows. But no barricade could hold the forest back. Roots began to creep across the floorboards, thin and wiry at first, then thicker, almost serpentine, wriggling beneath their feet. Panic set in. The red-marked one felt the pulse in his veins spike, the bloodroot thrumming beneath his skin in response to the forest's hunger. The shapes outside the windows twisted in unnatural ways, disappearing and reappearing, stalking silently. Each of their breaths was heavy, loud in the tension-filled room, echoing off walls that now seemed too thin to contain the danger. A sudden scraping came from the loft floorboards above them. Something had entered. One of the figures, a shadow that moved like water, slid along the ceiling, its limbs bending impossibly, tendrils of root dangling, dripping dark sap. The friends screamed, grabbing whatever they could for defense. The forest pressed closer, patient yet relentless, testing them. Branches began to break through the windows, splintering against walls and ceilings, as if the trees themselves were leaning in, reaching, clawing. The mist thickened, turning into a living wall, obscuring everything beyond the cabin. Shapes, rooted, pale, elongated, emerged, circling the building. They moved with intelligence, not randomly, herding their prey, forcing them into tighter spaces. One friend was dragged from the loft, limbs wrapped in tendrils of root, yanked into the mist with a scream that echoed across the mountains. The red-marked survivor tried to chase, but the forest resisted, roots tangling around his legs, pulling him back. The remaining friend fired frantically, grabbing a fireplace poker and swinging at the shadows. They passed through it as though through smoke, the poles striking nothing but mist and a faint trail of sap. By midnight, only one remained, the red-marked one. He stumbled to the cabin door, throwing it open in desperation. The forest greeted him like a living wall, thick mist curling around his boots, roots reaching out like grasping hands. Shapes moved in the fog, tall, pale, twisted, with limbs like branches and veins of red sap running through them. Eyes gleamed in the darkness, reflecting a hunger that transcended understanding. He ran blindly, pulled by instinct and terror, but every step was met with resistance. Roots snaked along the ground, tripping him, wrapping around his ankles. Branches lashed at his shoulders and face, tearing at skin and clothes. The forest moved deliberately, intelligent, hunting with patience that outlasted human fear. The red mark pulsed violently, almost painfully, as if the bloodroot beneath the soil was calling him home. Finally, he reached a small clearing, gasping, drenched in sweat and sap. The root, planted back in its hollow, pulsed faintly. For a moment, the forest hesitated, its hunting pause like a held breath. But the pause was brief. Pale shapes emerged from the mist, slow, deliberate, encircling him. Every instinct screamed to run, but the red pulse in his veins synchronized with the forest, tethering him to the ancient hunger of the mountains. The hunt had reached its climax. The forest was patient, but relentless. The bloodroot had claimed its due, and the mountains waited, knowing that what had begun would not end tonight. The clearing was still, but only momentarily. The forest seemed to exhale, the mist curling higher, thicker, moving with a deliberate grace that pressed against the survivor's skin. The red-marked one crouched near the hollow, where the bloodroot pulsed faintly, every heartbeat in his chest echoing the rhythm of the root beneath the soil. Sweat dripped into his eyes, his hands trembling, and a low hum filled the air, as if the mountains themselves were whispering in an ancient language. He could feel it. The forest was waiting, not attacking yet, but observing, testing. Every shadow in the mist was a potential threat. Every rustle a sign that the hunt had not ended. The red mark on his wrist throbbed violently, pulsing in tandem with the heartbeat of the root. He could feel it reaching through him, tugging at his very blood, reminding him that the mistake he had made, snatching the bloodroot, was unforgivable unless balance was restored. He recalled the library's warnings, the old librarian's words echoing in his mind. The bloodroot demanded balance. Return it willingly or be claimed. The forest's patience was endless, but finite for him. He had to act, and he had to act correctly. Every movement toward the hollow was tense. Mist curled around his legs like fingers, branches shifted to block his path, roots writhing beneath his boots. The air smelled metallic, thick with iron and decay. Pale shapes lurked in the edges of the mist, observing silently, testing, ensuring that fear coursed through him fully. He knelt before the hollow, hands trembling, and brushed aside the moss and soil to expose the bloodroot. Its white petals glowed faintly, red sap seeping into the surrounding earth. Pulsing with a heartbeat that matched his own. He whispered the fragments of old chants he'd memorized from the library, words of offering, of apology, of respect. The earth beneath his palms throbbed, responding, but not enough. The shapes in the mist began to move closer, tall and twisted, limbs entwined with roots, watching. The first attempt failed. He pushed the root gently into the hollow, but it tilted, refusing to settle. The forest reacted instantly. Roots surged from the ground, wrapping around his boots, yanking him backward. Branches snapping against his shoulders, drawing blood. He gritted his teeth, shouting the words again, pleading with the mountains, with the forest, with the ancient spirit of the bloodroot itself. Finally, the root accepted, sinking into the soil fully, its pulse steady but faint. A fragile silence followed, the mist pausing in midair as if waiting for the forest's judgment. But relief was short-lived. From the shadows, a tendril of root snaked toward him, thin and writhing, glowing faintly red, testing, claiming. The forest had accepted the offering, yes, but it had left its mark. He struck at the tendril with a branch, swinging blindly, but it recoiled, almost playfully, as if to remind him that the forest was patient but not forgiving. Every pulse of the red mark on his wrist ached violently, synchronizing with the heartbeat of the mountains, tethering him to their eternal patience. Exhausted, bleeding, trembling, he staggered to his feet. The mist thinned slightly, shapes receding into the edges, but the weight of the forest's gaze remained. The cabin loomed behind him, small and fragile, yet somehow part of this living, breathing wilderness. Every tree, every root, every shadow watched. He realized the truth. Survival was temporary, but the lesson was eternal. The mountains would remember, the forest would wait, and the bloodroot would pulse, patient and untouchable, until the next mistake was made. Night fell like a curtain over the mountains, thick and oppressive, blotting out the pale light of the moon. The forest around the clearing seemed to breathe, moving subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. Branches shifted, leaves whispered in languages older than memory, and the mist curled higher, wrapping the trees and rocks in gray coils that pulsed with intent. The red-marked survivor had returned to the cabin, bloodied, exhausted, but alive. Yet the forest's presence clung to him like a second skin. The bloodroot had been returned to its hollow, planted back into the earth with careful reverence. And for a brief moment, the forest had seemed to pause. But the pause was only a prelude. The mountains waited, and patience was their weapon. The survivor knew it instinctively. The forest was still hungry, still aware, and still testing him. Every shadow in the mist seemed to shift, stretching toward him, probing for weakness. He lit the hearth, the fire trembling in the hearth as if uncertain it could hold back the encroaching darkness. Outside, the mist pressed against the cabin walls, thick tendrils curling through cracks and under the door. The red pulse in his veins throbbed violently, in sync with the bloodroot beneath the soil. He could feel it reaching through him, a tether that reminded him every second that the forest's claim had not ended. The first sign came from the windows. A shadow moved across the glass, pale and thin, limbs twisted and elongated, rooted in ways no human body could replicate. It paused, watching, before sliding out of sight and into the thickening mist. The survivor's heart hammered, his breath shallow, and every instinct screamed to flee. But there was nowhere to run. The mountains surrounded him, the forest closed in, and the bloodroot pulsed like a drumbeat beneath the cabin floor. Suddenly, a scraping sound began at the loft stairs. Something moved there. Slow, deliberate, testing the structure. The survivor grabbed a fireplace poker and rushed up, only to see nothing, yet the floorboards creaked beneath weight that wasn't human. Roots snaked along the ceiling, wriggling like serpents, dripping dark sap. He swung blindly, striking only mist and shadows, the metallic tang of sap filling his nostrils. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, almost melodic, weaving through the mist and branches. Words he could not understand, syllables that pressed against his mind. The forest was speaking, or the mountains themselves, murmuring in rhythm with the pulse in his veins. Panic surged. He stumbled back toward the hollow, hands trembling, firelight casting his shadow like a double upon the walls. The final approach of the forest came gradually, inexorably. Shapes moved through the mist, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin, testing the survivor's courage, watching his every breath. One pale, elongated figure emerged closer, tendrils entwined with roots, dripping with sap that glistened faintly red in the firelight. Its eyes glimmered with ancient patience, unblinking, knowing. He reached the hollow, knees shaking, and pressed his hands against the soil around the bloodroot. Whispering fragments of old chants, he pleaded, not for mercy, but for balance, for survival. The root pulsed faintly in response, but the forest's hunger had not been sated. A tendril shot from the soil, striking his leg with surprising speed, wrapping tightly, constricting. Pain flared, and the red pulse on his wrist erupted violently, glowing like molten fire beneath his skin. He tried to pull away, screaming, swinging, but the tendril held fast. Roots from the surrounding earth began to surge upward, twisting and weaving around him, embedding themselves in his boots, legs, even arms. The forest was patient, yes, but patient meant deliberate. There was no mercy here, only balance, and the mountains demanded their due. The red-marked survivor sank to his knees in the hollow, clutching the soil around the bloodroot. He felt it pulse through him, the tether between himself and the ancient plant growing stronger, almost unbearable. His vision blurred as the forest pressed in, shapes writhing in the mist, branches lashing, tendrils wrapping, the pulse in his veins synchronizing with every heartbeat of the mountains. He realized, with a shiver of final understanding, that the forest's claim was absolute. Life and mistake were intertwined, and balance demanded acknowledgement, surrender. Then, with a final shuddering pulse, the forest released him. But not entirely. He collapsed against the mossy ground, gasping, bleeding from shallow scratches where branches had lashed, his limbs trembling. The bloodroot remained, white and unbroken in its hollow, but the pulse in his veins lingered, faint yet insistent. The forest had accepted the offering, but it had left its mark. He was free, yes, but tethered forever to the mountains, the mist, and the ancient hunger that slumbered beneath the soil. When morning broke, the cabin seemed untouched, serene, almost inviting. The mist had receded, the mountains silent, and the forest appeared calm. But the survivor knew the truth. The mountains watched, the forest waited, and the bloodroot pulsed quietly, patiently, remembering. Somewhere in the shadowed ridges, the ancient hunger lingered, always patient, always waiting for the next hand foolish enough to disturb it. He stood alone, bloodied, exhausted, forever changed. The mountains were quiet, but their patience was infinite. Somewhere, deep in the forest, a faint pulse could still be felt, a heartbeat that promised the cycle would continue. The forest had taught its lesson. The red-marked survivor would carry it always. An eternal reminder of what it meant to disturb the balance of the Appalachians.